Don't bother coming to the airport tomorrow. Dad, the text message read, vibrating with a self-importance that Ledger hadn't earned. I looked at the screen with the same level of interest I'd give a typo in a contract, annoyed, but ready to correct it. My son followed up with a sentence that he likely thought was a mercy. I'm taking Saffron instead. You and Mom are just too old for the pace of these high-end resorts. I sat there in the quiet of my study, the leather chair offering more support than my own flesh and blood ever had. He truly believed he was doing us a favor by sparing us the exhaustion of a vacation I had funded with 40 years of calculated risks. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing. But for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. At 60, you realize that some people don't grow up. They just get taller and more expensive to maintain. I didn't feel my heart race or my hands shake. I simply felt the click of a final puzzle piece falling into place. Marilla was downstairs, probably making tea, still under the impression we were leaving for the Maldives at dawn. Ledger's arrogance was a fascinating thing to observe, a byproduct of a life where every safety net was woven from my bank account. He assumed my silence was a sign of confusion, or perhaps the slow processing speed of a mind he deemed past its prime. He was wrong. I wasn't confused. I was merely deciding which of his luxuries to strip away first to make the lesson stick. It is a dangerous thing to assume a lion is a rug just because he is lying still. By the time Ledger boarded that plane, he wouldn't just be leaving the country. He would be leaving the reality he thought he owned. I opened the digital ledger for the trust fund and began the quiet, surgical process of deletion. Marilla was in the kitchen, meticulously packing a jar of her homegrown pickles into a designer suitcase lined with Italian silk. You know the Maldives have five-star catering. Dear, I remarked, watching her wrap the glass in a pashmina that cost more than Ledger's first insurance premium. She didn't look up. Her hands were as steady as they were 40 years ago when we were building our first warehouse in the rain. I hadn't shared Ledger's too-old manifesto with her yet, choosing instead to savor the pressurized silence before the inevitable explosion. There is a specific kind of anxiety in watching a storm gather on the horizon while your house is still bathed in deceptive sunlight. I attempted to check the departure times on our new smart fridge, but the touchscreen insisted I needed a firmware update just to tell me the time. I stared at the blinking loading bar, feeling a brief, sharp urge to introduce the appliance to a heavy wrench, a feeling Ledger would surely misinterpret as a senior moment. Instead, I poured a finger of 20-year-old rye, the kind that bites back and reminds you that you're still very much alive. From the study window, I watched Ledger's sports car, a vehicle currently registered to my holding company, tear down the driveway with a roar of unearned confidence. Saffron sat in the passenger seat, her sunglasses reflecting a world she thought she'd finally conquered through proximity to my son's wallet. Ledger drove like a man who believed the road was a private gift, never once looking back at the house that provided his every comfort. My phone pinged with a notification for a pre-vacation shopping spree withdrawal, a sum that would have fed a small village for a month. I didn't flag the transaction as fraud. I simply began the digital process of migrating the rest of the liquid assets into a vault he didn't even know existed. It wasn't about the money. It was about the fundamental arrogance of a boy who thought the sun rose specifically to tan his back. Marilla finally paused, her eyes shifting from her pickles to my empty, unzipped bags by the door. He isn't coming to the airport, is he, Thayer? She asked, her voice as cool and sharp as a winter morning. He says we're too old for the pace, Marilla, I said, setting my glass down on the marble counter with a soft, final thud. Her expression didn't shift, but she tightened her grip on a porcelain mug until her knuckles turned the color of ivory. It is a peculiar insult to be told you lack the pace for a lifestyle you personally financed through decades of 60-hour work weeks. I tried to activate the house's new security away mode via the voice-controlled hub, but the system misheard me and started reciting a recipe for lemon tart. I stared at the blinking LED ring, wondering why the modern world insists on making simple things so incredibly chatty and incompetent. Cancel command, I said firmly, but the machine began listing the nutritional benefits of citrus instead. I looked at Marilla, and we both shared a brief, dry smile. The kind you have when the world tries to convince you that you're the one who's glitching. Ledger was likely at the airport by now, checking into the first-class lounge with Saffron, basking in the glow of a status he hadn't earned. The injustice didn't lie in the missed vacation, but in the casual way he had discarded us like an outdated piece of software. He viewed our years not as a reservoir of strength, but as a slow leak that made us unreliable. He was currently ordering champagne on my credit line, laughing about how he'd spared us the heat and the crowds. I didn't feel the need to shout. I simply felt a cold, familiar clarity settle into my bones, the same clarity I used to hostilely take over competing firms in the 90s. I sat back down at my computer and opened the deed for the colonial-style house Ledger occupied 3 blocks away. I had bought that house as a temporary help when he finished college, and apparently, 10 years was exactly long enough for him to forget who actually signed the mortgage. My mouse hovered over the proceed with liquidation icon, and for a moment, I considered the irony of his upcoming tan. He was going to look very healthy and relaxed while he searched for a new place to sleep. I watched the cursor blink on the real estate agent's portal, a digital heartbeat representing the end of Ledger's rent-free era. There's a specific brand of silence that settles in a house when you realize you've raised a parasite instead of a partner. I tried to lean in closer to read the fine print, but my reading glasses were missing again, only to be found perched atop my head like a pair of plastic antlers. I suppose I am old enough to lose my spectacles, but I'm certainly not too old to remember the exact password to the accounts Ledger thinks are his inheritance. I clicked confirm sale on his residence. A cash buyer from a tech firm had been sniffing around that street for weeks. Marilla walked in, holding a dusty bottle of Scotch we'd saved for his wedding, a wedding that had devolved into a series of expensive mistakes named Saffron. He just posted a photo, she said, her voice flat. They're in the VIP lounge, toasted by our retirement fund. It's fascinating how the younger generation equates a high-resolution selfie with actual success. Ledger didn't realize that the pace he so desperately wanted to set for us was about to hit a brick wall made of legal documents. I reached for my phone to call my lawyer, but accidentally triggered the voice assistant, which began playing a disco track at maximum volume. I let the beat play for a moment, finding the rhythm strangely appropriate for a man who was currently burning his own bridges. I sent the final email to the eviction specialist, instructing them to have the locks changed within 48 hours. The pity Ledger felt for us was a luxury he could no longer afford. He wanted a resort experience, so I decided to give him the most authentic one, checking out. The notification chime on my phone wasn't a thank you text. It was the bank confirming that Ledger's secondary card had just been declined at the duty-free shop. The first crack in his paradise was about to widen into a canyon. The phone buzzed again, a frantic series of texts from Ledger asking why the platinum card was behaving like a piece of useless plastic in the middle of a duty-free shop. I didn't reply. I simply watched the bubbles appear and disappear on the screen, his digital panic providing a more satisfying rhythm than the disco music from earlier. Marilla was currently engaged in a minor skirmish with our new automated vacuum cleaner, which had managed to trap itself under a velvet ottoman and was now chirping for help in a polite, robotic voice. I nudged the machine with the toe of my polished Oxford, wondering if Ledger felt as stuck and confused as this expensive puck of sensors. It lacks the pace for this room, apparently. I told the vacuum, enjoying the dry wit of my own observation while Marilla stifled a laugh. I turned my attention back to the trust account, the digital gateway to the effortless life Ledger thought was his birthright. People my age are often accused of being stuck in the past, but the truth is, we simply know how to recognize a recurring pattern when we see one. Ledger had become a recurring error in my life's work, and I have never been one to let a mistake compound its interest. I authorized the total transfer of his monthly allowance into a charitable foundation for the preservation of historic libraries. At least someone would finally appreciate the value of old stories. My son thinks that wealth is a permanent state of nature, like the weather, rather than a garden that requires constant weeding and a very sharp pair of shears. I felt a strange, invigorating lightness, the kind that comes when you finally stop trying to hold up a ceiling that is determined to collapse. I looked at the Mediterranean cruise itinerary on my desk, a voyage designed for those who prefer history and wine over neon lights and shallow pools. We weren't going to the Maldives to be too old on a beach. We were going to Europe to be exactly who we've earned the right to be. I clicked the final submit button on the eviction notice for the house he occupied, my hand as steady as a surgeon's. The real estate agent messaged back instantly. The new owners were eager to take the keys by Monday morning. Ledger was likely still standing at the boarding gate, but he was already technically homeless and lacked the credit to buy a bottled water. I wondered how Saffron would enjoy the pace of a long walk home from the airport. The phone was buzzing with such frequency now that it began to migrate toward the edge of the mahogany desk like a frantic, trapped insect. I watched it with the same clinical curiosity I'd apply to a nature documentary about failing predators, refusing to grant Ledger the satisfaction of a connection. I tried to pour myself a coffee from our new bean-to-cup machine, but it informed me via a sleek LED screen that my caffeine profile needed a cloud update before it would dispense a single drop. I stared at the machine, briefly considering if this was the pace Ledger thought I couldn't handle. A world where a kitchen appliance demands a password for a morning beverage. I didn't get angry. I simply went to the pantry and found the old French press, which, much like myself, requires no software updates to perform its duty perfectly. Marilla walked past the study door, carrying a stack of Ledger's old varsity trophies toward the donation bin with the grace of a woman finishing a long overdue chore. He keeps calling to say there's a glitch in his accounts, she murmured, her voice steady, but her eyes as sharp as a winter frost. I looked at a photo on the wall of Ledger's graduation, a day where I felt a pride that now felt like a heavy, misplaced debt. The internal break people talk about isn't a loud snap. It's a quiet, final realization that the person you built a legacy for views you as nothing more than a vault with a slowing processor. Ledger didn't see a father when he looked at me. He saw a biological obstacle standing between him and a perpetual vacation. He had replaced our presence with Saffron's vanity because he thought our expiration date had finally arrived. I felt no guilt as I watched a professional locksmith's van pull up to the house Ledger currently occupied 3 blocks away. If I am too old to enjoy a luxury resort, then surely he is too young to handle the complexities of an actual mortgage. I am not a vengeful man by nature, but I have always been a very thorough one when it comes to closing out bad investments. I watched through the window as the locksmith began the process of erasing Ledger's access to the only home he'd ever known as an adult. By the time his plane landed in the Maldives, the locks would be changed and the keys would be in the hands of a stranger. I stood in the foyer, the silence of the house weighing more than the heavy winter coat I probably didn't need for a Mediterranean cruise. I attempted to set the house to vacation mode on the wall-mounted tablet, but my fingers, thick from years of honest labor, kept hitting pet mode instead. The house responded by emitting a high-frequency whistle meant to soothe a non-existent terrier, and I simply sighed, refusing to let a piece of poorly designed circuitry win. Marilla walked down the stairs, looking like she was headed to a royal gala rather than a cruise terminal, her elegance a stark contrast to the chaos Ledger had left in his wake. My phone chimed one last time, a frantic, garbled voicemail from Ledger, his voice cracking as he realized the resort in the Maldives wouldn't accept a promise of future payment. He called me impossible, a title I wear with more pride than any of the honorary degrees I've been handed over the years. It is a quiet rage that fuels a man who has spent his life building foundations only to watch his heir treat them like disposable stage props. I am not too old for the world. I am simply finished with the parts of it that don't respect the hands that built it. I checked my watch, a mechanical timepiece that doesn't need a Wi-Fi signal to tell the truth, and saw it was time to leave for the port. The ship awaiting us was named the Saffron, a detail I found particularly fitting given the financial coup I had just executed. Ledger thinks he is on a journey of discovery, but the only thing he will discover upon landing is the cold weight of his own signature on an empty bank statement. I locked the front door, the solid click of the bolt echoing through the hall like a period at the end of a very long, exhausting sentence. I handed the keys to the estate manager, giving him clear instructions. If Ledger returns before we do, he is to be treated as any other trespasser. We stepped into the car, and for the first time in years, the air felt clean, devoid of the suffocating scent of unearned privilege. As the engine purred to life, I realized I hadn't just emptied Ledger's pockets. I had finally cleared the path for a future where his shadow no longer dimmed our light. But as we pulled away, I saw Marilla's face in the rearview mirror, and I knew her version of this story was only just beginning.
I watched Thayer close his laptop with that specific, sharp click that usually meant a competitor was about to lose their shirt. He thinks he's the only one who felt the sting of Ledger's message, but a mother's hearing is tuned to the frequency of betrayal long before the words are actually typed. Too old for the pace, our son had written, as if he hadn't been lagging behind my expectations since the third grade. I spent the morning wrestling with a smart luggage scale that insisted our bags were overweight because I'd packed 3 jars of my signature preserves. Apparently, the digital age has no room for a good pickle. I stared at the blinking error message and thought that Ledger was currently making the exact same mistake with his own life's balance. I had seen Saffron's shadow in our guest wing last month, smelling of synthetic vanilla and social climbing, and I simply waited for her to trip. She believed she was invisible, but I've spent 60 years learning how to read the air in a room. I didn't say a word when they borrowed the silver for their little party, because I prefer to let people hang themselves with the rope they think they're stealing. While Thayer was handling the liquidation, I was the one who quietly revoked the guest access to the coastal cottage. It's amazing how fast a digital key can expire. I might forget where I put my reading glasses once an hour, but I never forget the exact tone of a lie told by someone I carried for 9 months. Ledger thinks he has my grace, but he's forgotten he also inherited my father's penchant for absolute, surgical finality. I straightened my pearls, feeling the cool weight of them against my skin, a reminder that some things only get more valuable and harder to break with time. We aren't going on a cruise to hide from the world. We're going to watch from a distance as the world we built finally stops rotating for those who didn't appreciate the gravity. I took a final look at the driveway, wondering if Ledger would still feel fast when he realized his car's GPS had been remotely locked to only lead him to a bus depot. I hadn't told Thayer that I also called the charity shop to come and collect every piece of furniture in Ledger's living room by noon today. If our son wants to live a life of high-end leisure, he can start by learning how to sleep comfortably on a bare floor. While Thayer was busy with the lawyers, I took a quiet moment to sit in the garden with a tablet, trying to figure out why the smart sprinklers were currently soaking the stone lions instead of the lawn. Ledger had always handled the house apps, a task he performed with a condescending sigh that suggested he was translating Greek for a toddler. I tapped the screen too hard, and instead of fixing the water, I accidentally opened a shared cloud folder Ledger hadn't realized I could still see. My breath caught not in a gasp, but in a slow, icy realization when I saw the digital appraisals for my grandmother's Victorian jewelry set. He hadn't just intended to take Saffron to the Maldives. He was planning to fund her influencer lifestyle by auctioning off pieces of my history while we were safely tucked away at sea. I tried to close the window, but my thumb slipped, and I somehow managed to subscribe to a pro-gamer streaming service for $20 a month, a minor casualty in a much larger war. I sat there in the afternoon sun, watching a small, confused robot lawnmower bump repeatedly into Thayer's favorite rosebushes, and I felt a clarity that would have terrified my son. He thought my silence over the years was a lack of awareness, but it was actually a meticulous collection of evidence. Every lost heirloom and every misplaced investment had been recorded in the ledgers of my memory, waiting for the balance to be called. Saffron's vanity was the fuel, but Ledger's greed was the engine, and they were both driving straight off a cliff of their own making. I deleted the shared access to the appraisals with a single, firm tap, feeling a grim satisfaction as the available status on several items vanished back into private. It is one thing to insult my age, but it is quite another to treat my legacy like a garage sale for a woman who thinks vintage means anything made before the year 2010. I walked back into the house, passing the empty space where the grandfather clock used to stand, and realized Ledger hadn't just taken a vacation, he had already started looting the tomb. But the pharaoh wasn't dead yet, and I was about to make sure the entrance was permanently sealed. I found the list in the wastebasket of the guest room, crumpled like a discarded draft of a bad play. It was Saffron's handwriting, loopy, aggressive, and entirely devoid of punctuation, outlining a plan that went far beyond a stolen vacation. Move mother's vanity to the master, sell the old rugs, change the locks while they're at sea. The note read, a roadmap for a hostile takeover of my own home. I tried to use my phone to photograph this evidence, but the camera was stuck in portrait mode, blurring the text and focusing intensely on a nearby bowl of decorative lemons instead. I stared at the artistic photo of the citrus fruit, wondering why a device designed for genius is so often committed to stupidity. Eventually, I just folded the paper and tucked it into my clutch. A physical copy is much harder to delete from a server. Ledger hadn't just been sparing us the Maldives. He had been measuring our rooms for new curtains and calculating the resale value of our history. He viewed our departure as an abdication, a quiet exit into the fog of old age where we would simply fade away. It's a common mistake among the young to assume that because we walk slower, we aren't thinking 10 moves ahead. I walked to the wall safe behind the portrait of my great-uncle, the one Ledger always joked looked like a grumpy pirate. I removed the original copies of the property deeds and replaced them with high-quality photocopies, a little trap for whenever Ledger decided to try and secure a loan against our home. I noticed my hands were as steady as stone, fueled by the sheer, focused adrenaline of a woman protecting her nest. I checked the front door camera one last time and saw the estate's new security team arriving, men who don't care about pace, only about perimeter. Ledger's plane would be landing in 2 hours, right about the time his phone service would be suspended for non-payment. The silence he wanted for us was about to become his own reality. We were at the terminal, the air conditioning humming with a clinical efficiency that reminded me of a hospital waiting room. Thader was currently engaged in a silent, heated debate with a self-service check-in kiosk that refused to recognize his passport, likely because he was holding it upside down while searching for his reading glasses. "The machine says I don't exist, Marilla," he muttered, a dry smirk playing on his lips despite the minor technical defeat. I didn't answer because my own phone had begun to vibrate with a frantic intensity, Ledger's name flashing on the screen like a warning light. He had landed in the Maldives, and the sudden absence of a chauffeured car and a functioning credit card had clearly shattered the illusion of his grand adventure. I answered, not because I wanted to hear his excuses, but because I wanted him to hear the sound of a mother who had finally stopped making them for him. "Mom, what is going on?" "The hotel says the reservation is canceled and my phone is about to be cut off," he hissed, his voice thin and desperate over the thousands of miles. I looked at my reflection in the polished glass of the terminal, seeing a woman who had survived enough paces to outrun a boy who couldn't even manage his own luggage. "It's a glitch in the system, Ledger, the system of your life that you thought was automated," I replied, my voice as smooth as the silk scarf around my neck. He started to shout something about Saffron being humiliated in front of the resort staff, as if her social standing was a currency I still traded in. I let him talk, listening to the hollow echo of his entitlement until he finally ran out of breath. There is a profound power in simply saying nothing while someone else realizes they have no ground left to stand on. I noticed a small smudge on my suitcase and spent a few seconds buffing it out with a tissue, giving his panic the exact amount of attention it deserved. Thayer finally won his battle with the kiosk, the machine spitting out our boarding passes like a white flag of surrender. "We're boarding now, dear," I said into the phone, and I didn't wait for a reply before I ended the call. The confrontation wasn't about who could shout the loudest. It was about who still held the map. Ledger was in paradise, but he was starting to realize that without our slow presence, paradise was just an expensive cage. I watched the signal bars on my phone drop to 0 as we moved toward the gate, knowing that by the time I turned it back on, his world would be unrecognizable. We settled into our suite on the cruise ship, a space filled with far too many touchscreens and not enough simple light switches. I spent 5 minutes trying to open the automated curtains, only to realize I was pressing the button for emergency lighting, which bathed our room in a festive but very confusing crimson glow. Thayer just sat in the armchair, watching me with a look that suggested he'd already accepted that the machines were winning the small battles while we clearly won the war. My phone buzzed one last time in my bag, a text from Ledger's neighbor back home, whom I'd asked to keep an eye on the property. They reported that the moving trucks had arrived at Ledger's house, and the new owners were already unloading minimalist furniture onto the lawn where my son used to play as a child. There is a sharp, distinct pang in realizing that the place where your son took his first steps is now just a line item in a real estate transaction. But that pang wasn't regret. It was the clinical sting of a disinfectant on a wound that had been festering for far too many years. Ledger had tried to trade our dignity for a week of sun and fake prestige, never considering that the roof over his head was supported by the very old hands he mocked. I looked out at the ocean, the vast, dark water reminding me that life is indifferent to those who don't know how to steer their own ship. Saffron would likely be screaming at him now, her affection for him evaporating the moment his bank balance hit zero. I almost felt sorry for him, the way one feels sorry for a character in a tragedy who refuses to read the script until the final act. Thayer finally stood up, having mastered the light panel, and the room was suddenly filled with a warm, golden glow. "He'll call the police when he gets back and finds the locks changed, you know," Thayer said, his voice devoid of worry. "Let him," I replied, smoothing out the silk on the bed. It will be the first time in his life he's had to explain his actions to someone who isn't his mother. The ship began to move, a slow, powerful vibration under our feet that signaled the start of a journey Ledger was no longer invited to join. The real threat wasn't what he would do next, but the realization that we were finally, perfectly fine without him. The ship's dining room was a sea of crystal and soft jazz, a world away from the frantic texts Ledger was likely still trying to send from a borrowed Wi-Fi hotspot. Thayer was currently engaged in a silent, dignified battle with a QR code on the table, trying to convince his phone that he wanted to see the wine list and not take a selfie with the tablecloth. "Apparently, Marilla, the grapes won't reveal themselves until I've accepted the ship's cookies," he remarked, his eyebrows arched in that dry, vintage amusement I've loved for 40 years. I watched him finally give up and simply ask a passing waiter for something old and stubborn, which felt like a fitting description for both the wine and the man sitting across from me. Beneath the humor, however, there was a weight, the finality of the bridge we had just burned. Ledger would be boarding a flight back soon, fueled by a mixture of sunburned rage and the desperate belief that he could still talk his way back into our wallets. He didn't know yet that the moving company had already finished clearing his temporary home, leaving nothing but the dust of his own entitlement behind. Saffron would likely discover that her influencer status didn't cover the cost of a taxi from the airport once the shared accounts were truly purged. I felt a strange, cold peace, the kind that comes after a surgeon has successfully removed a malignant growth. We weren't just taking a vacation, we were reclaiming the air we breathed, no longer forced to filter it through our son's constant, expensive needs. I thought about the grandmother's jewelry he had tried to appraisal, and I felt a sharp, focused pride in knowing it was now locked in a vault he would never touch. The pace of our lives was now entirely our own, measured in the slow drift of the horizon rather than the frantic demands of an ungrateful heir. As the waiter poured the deep, dark red wine, Thayer raised his glass, and for the first time in a decade, his eyes were free of the exhaustion that comes from being a constant safety net. Ledger's flight would land in 12 hours, and he was about to find out exactly how much a legacy costs when you try to steal it. We were back on our own veranda, the evening air smelling of jasmine and the faint salt we'd brought home from the Mediterranean. Thayer was currently engaged in a rhythmic, determined battle with the outdoor heater, clicking the remote with a persistence that sounded like a Morse code message for "send a technician." He finally abandoned the gadget with a dry chuckle and pulled up the security feed from Ledger's former street on his tablet. There they were on the screen, Ledger and Saffron, looking brilliantly tanned and utterly bewildered, standing on a sidewalk next to 3 lonely suitcases. Saffron was wearing a sun hat the size of a satellite dish, her face contorted in a mask of disbelief as she realized the gate code she'd once treated as her own had been erased. Ledger was pacing, his phone pressed to his ear, likely hearing the same automated silence I'd arranged before we even reached the cruise terminal. Thayer squinted at the screen, adjusted his glasses, and remarked that Saffron's tan was a bit too orange, resembling a poorly maintained piece of antique furniture. It is a quiet, surgical kind of justice to watch someone finally realize that the pace they mocked was the only thing keeping them from the hard reality of the pavement. I didn't feel the urge to call or to soften the blow. A mother's duty is to teach a child to walk, but eventually, you must let them feel the gravity they spent a lifetime ignoring. The new owners of the house came to the gate, handed Ledger a small box of his remaining mail, and walked back inside without a single word of apology. Thayer finally got the heater to ignite, the warm orange glow reflecting in his eyes as he leaned back and took a slow, satisfied sip of his tea. We hadn't broken our sun, we had simply stopped holding up the sky for someone who thought he'd invented the clouds. Ledger would eventually find a way to survive, but he would never again mistake our stillness for a lack of strength. I reached over and took Thayer's hand, feeling the firm, steady grip of a partner who knew exactly how to protect what we'd built. We sat together in the warmth of our own making, watching the sun set on a lesson that was 40 years overdue.